Our Father in
Thank
heaven,
you.
we thank Thee for the blessings that we have. We're so grateful for the opportunity to study and learn about the history of the early days of the Restoration. We ask Thy blessings to be on Mrs. Adams, and we ask Thy blessings to be on the technology, that it will work well, that we will be able to receive and hear and understand. We say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. We are beginning a second part of Kirtland and the making of a covenant people. So last week we talked about the Lord giving the commandment in section 88 for the brethren to call a solemn assembly. They understood that this would be a temple meeting, and in that was in verse 70 of section 88, and in that same section, toward the end of the section, beginning at about verse 27, the Lord begins to talk to them about the brethren participating in the ordinance of the washing of feet. And they began immediately, right after this revelation was received on December 27th of 1832, they went into an organization of some of this School of the Prophets business and participated in January and February, I guess, in the washing of feet. But we're going to go forward a little, and we're seeing a preparatory and training period begin for the restoration of the partial endowment that is received in the Kirtland Temple. Last week we made mention of the fact that part of the preparation for this was concerning the Abrahamic papyrus that Joseph Smith came into possession of, which was one of the points that we intended to cover, and we didn't get there. So what we're going to do today is go there before we move on. So our lesson considerations last week were about the revelations that began to plant temple concepts in Joseph's mind, how the temple instructions began to unfold in Kirtland, and what part the Abrahamic papyrus played in Kirtland Temple understanding. And that's where we are today for just a few minutes before we go into the rest of what we want to talk about today. Now, as we do this, I hope that you don't feel really rushed as we go through the mummies. When my husband and I taught church history at Harvard and Boston College a few years ago in Massachusetts, we discovered that our students had never heard of the mummies. So this was kind of a fun discussion with them. So to pick up where we left off, the brethren broke the ground on June 5th of 1833, and 2 months later they laid the cornerstones after the order of the holy priesthood. Now all through this discussion the Lord keeps talking about the order of, the order of, the order of. Everything is done in a precise order, and the brethren have to follow that order. That order is to teach them things. It's to teach them about the organization of the Godhead. It's to teach them about the organization and the administration of the priesthood. And so they followed the order that the Lord gave them, with the proper individuals laying the proper stone in the proper place, and the next quorum down, laying the next stone, and so forth, and all of these things had to be in order. So we learned that the first presidency laid the stone on the southeast corner, and the remaining 3 cornerstones were laid by other leaders. It was a big thing to lay a cornerstone. I didn't realize how big a thing this was until I was reviewing The Mountain of the Lord's House, which is a film the church produced on the building of the Salt Lake Temple, and watched them lower the cornerstone with the cranes into place. It was a big thing in Kirtland. So what we're looking at here is Mother Smith talking to us about the privations and the difficulties that it took to build this temple. In 1833 to 1836, everything in Kirtland centered around the construction of this temple. The hearts of the people were just thrown into this, and they were completely involved. The women did everything that they could to help provide for the workmen. We know that they sewed on the veils of the temple, which are not the same thing as the veils in the temple today, but had a particular purpose. We know that Heber C. Kimball said, "My wife worked as hard as any man who worked on this temple, and so did these other women." According to the prophet's mother, the saints had to endure great fatigue and privation in consequence of the opposition they met with from their enemies, which was so great that they were compelled to keep a guard around the walls much of the time until they were completed. So we had men who slept in the temple and who kept weapons with them to defend the temple in case the mobs who had threatened were going to do something disastrous to it. So Mother Smith said they gave no sleep to their eyes nor slumber to their eyelids until they found a place for the Lord, a habitation for the mighty God of Jacob. You can see there what this temple meant to her. There was but one mainspring to all our thoughts and actions, and that was the building of the Lord's house. Now this is a little picture of a stone quarry where the brethren got the stone to build most of the stone for the temple. And when the construction began, Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, Brigham Young, Lorenzo D. Young, his brother Reynolds Cahoon, rode south to the quarry. It was 2 miles from the site, and made sure that the stone was suitable for the temple walls, which would be 2 feet thick and more than 60 feet high. And they would load their wagons, and other workmen would also take the stone back to the construction site. Now Joseph was a foreman in the quarry, and he went to quarrying rock just like the rest of us. We see here Elder Kimball telling us how this was done. And he would dress in his tow frock. This was a kind of a linen frock and breeches, and work in the quarry, quarrying stone just like the rest of us. And then on Saturday we brought out every team to draw stone to the temple, and we continued doing that till the house was finished. So everyone who was available, who had a team, was enlisted to help in this process. And Brother Kimball says the people who didn't have teams went to work in the stone quarry and prepared the stones for drawing them to the house. And Joseph Smith was our foreman in the quarry. Now we come to the mummies. They've been working on this temple. They've been thinking about this temple from the time of New York. But when they came into Kirtland, and in 1832, the brethren were told in their meeting, which is something that amounted to the School of the Prophets, that they were to call this a solemn assembly and build this temple. They were dedicated to this, and they were thinking about the revelations that Joseph had been given, and the things that were scriptural about temple building and so forth. And here we get all of a sudden this wonderful gift from heaven. It does have a bearing on their understanding of temple ordinances. It came to have a greater bearing when they went into Nauvoo. In fact, in Nauvoo, it had a monumental bearing on the things that they learned and did there in establishing a full endowment. But in this case, we're just in an infant stage, and in the infant stage the Lord is just pouring so many things into the minds of these people and opening up their thought processes and changing them from a worldly people into a covenant or temple people. That's why we call this lesson the making of a covenant people. They're learning and doing and becoming an entirely different people in the process of what's happening here. And the mummies contribute to this, and so we get from Joseph Smith's history and from other histories a little historical background on what was happening there. Joseph Smith writes a great deal about this in his diary or his journal, and this is transferred into the history of the church, where he tells us this same information that I am taking here from Brother Peterson, who is an expert on this story, that Antonio Lobolo went into the catacombs of Egypt in the place where the city of Thebes once stood. This is Luxor now. And he took 11 mummies from these catacombs. Now you can see this charming photograph of the mummies up here. I'm supposing that some of you are wondering if that really is accurate, and I just have to say no, it isn't, but it's for our pleasure. The mummies came into the hands of Michael Chandler at Lobolo's death. He was supposedly, or apparently, was the nephew of Antonio Lobolo, who was a man of considerable import in the world of antiquities and anthropology. These mummies came into his hands, and he started exhibiting them through the United States eastern United States from 1833 to 1835. And almost as soon as he got those off the boat, he knew there were inscriptions and writings that he wanted translated, and someone recommended to him immediately Joseph Smith as a translator. Other people did mention this to him also, but they did it sarcastically. Everywhere he exhibited these mummies, they were received with acclaim. And people saw the rolls of papyrus, the hieroglyphics, the wrappers, and the other appliances. They were all exceedingly interesting. And so the papers sent out their reporters, and every illustrious man of science went to examine the mummies, and everyone agreed that they were of considerable antiquity, and it was a marvelous thing. So we see their response to this is very positive and excited, and it was a big occasion to have the mummies come to your town where you could go and see something from the past of this nature. So people would even imagine how this could be. Maybe these were persons who flourished when Moses and Aaron were little boys and deserved public attention. It's an interesting thought in the Saturday Evening Post of 1833. We have testimony after testimony of persons who said, yes, these were actually authentic antiquities from the past. So now we come along to Mr. Charles Anthon, because at a certain point, Mr. Chandler goes to Mr. Anthon and takes the papyrus scrolls and the parchment fragments that came with the mummies and asked Mr. Anthon if he could translate the material. Now, the Rosetta Stone at this point had not been interpreted, and people had very little understanding in terms of what we know today. It was almost minuscule of these ancient languages, but Mr. Anthon gave him a certificate of translation, and Chandler then came to see Joseph Smith. And this is the home in which Joseph Smith lived when Mr. Chandler arrived. Mr. Chandler stayed in a hotel in Kirtland called the Riggs Hotel. And while he was in this hotel, he sent a notice to Joseph that he wanted him to come and look at these mummies, see if he could work on the translation. And Joseph wrote him a letter, sent him a letter, and said, I'm not able to come tonight. I have a prior engagement, but in the morning I will look at them, and I will come and call on you. And Mr. Chandler sent him some of the papyrus and left it with the prophet Joseph Smith overnight. And Joseph went over it as soon as he was able, and then gave to Mr. Chandler his translation. So Chandler says here, Brother Peterson says here, Mr. Chandler then showed the prophet Joseph Charles Anthon's translation and stated that the translations of the prophet and the professor agreed to a point, but that there was one language that Professor Anthon could not translate that the prophet did, which is very interesting in light of all of the flap over Professor Anthon wanting to translate the Book of Mormon, but he wasn't able to because it was a sealed book. Michael Chandler gave Joseph says he responded like a gentleman and gave me this certificate saying that anyone who wanted to know Mr. Joseph Smith Jr. in deciphering the ancient hieroglyphic characters, or the Egyptian characters, which I have in many eminent cities showed to the most learned, and from the information that I could ever learn or meet with, I find that of Mr. Joseph Smith Jr. to correspond in the most minute matters. So the prophet made note of that in his journal and kept a record of this incident. Well, Joseph Smith was interested in purchasing the papyrus. And Chandler told the prophet that he had sold all the mummies but 4, and he wasn't going to sell these writings unless he could sell the last of the mummies with them. Now, we learn that Joseph Smith paid $2,400 for the mummies and the papyrus, which today would equate to about $35,000 or $40,000, but Joseph didn't pay for all of this. The saints raised what they could, but there were other gentlemen in the area who were not members of the church who were very interested in these writings, and they contributed a considerable amount of this money and donated the mummies and the papyrus to the prophet Joseph Smith. And Joseph made these available for their inspection whenever they wanted, and people came continually from this point until they left Kirtland to see these mummies, and Joseph would often show them, and he says in his journal repeatedly, I showed the mummies, I showed the papyrus to this group or to that group, and I explained to them the ancient writings and some of the customs and manners of the ancient people. So he tells us that on the 6th of June, 1835, he started translating some of the characters on the mummies. I'm finding that date a little bit interesting because I had in my mind that the mummies didn't arrive there until July. So I wonder if I should check this to be precise, but nevertheless he tells us, I commenced translating these characters and found that one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham, another the writings of Joseph of Egypt, and so forth, a more full account of which will appear in its place as I proceed to examine or unfold them. Now this is right after Joseph had received these mummies. The interesting thing is that the papyrus contained a great deal of writing, so much so that Joseph Smith has indicated that to translate all of it would be a larger translation than the Bible itself. It was just, he thought, a lot of information contained in there. In other words, it was going to be a great deal of information given to us. Now, exactly how much there was we wouldn't know because we don't have all of that papyrus anymore. But when he tells us here it contained the writings of Abraham and the writings of Joseph of Egypt, we know that we don't have the writings of Joseph of Egypt. And when Joseph says, I will unfold them and make them available to people as I'm able to do that, he did what he could, but by the time that he was assassinated, he was not able to complete doing this great and very interesting work. Nevertheless, he gave us what essentially was necessary for us to have, apparently, to increase understanding of temple ordinances and so forth. Because what you need to understand about the book of Abraham as we have it is that it is a temple book, and that the purpose in it is to begin to acquaint the children of Abraham, as he says in the first chapter, I wrote this for my posterity, with the ordinances that bring salvation. So Joseph says, I worked on these scrolls, and in July he said I did research, and during this research the principles of astronomy as understood by Father Abraham and the ancients were unfolded to our understanding. And when he talks about that, he tells us how the heavens are governed, and part of this is on the hypocephalus that comes with the papyrus, and is something that is buried with the eminent Egyptian, which is supposed to help see him into the eternal life, and which contains a great deal of what we know is temple ceremonial material. And so Joseph says here he sees the order that the stars are arranged in, and we can read about that in the 2nd chapter of the book of Abraham. And he talks about the great governing fixed star, which is the farthest that has ever been discovered by the fathers, and is Kolob. And in Joseph Smith's writings, he indicates to us Kolob represents perhaps the sun, and other planets as they move into their positions are representative of various of the great spirits who administer the gospel or the prophets, as Abraham was. So it's a dramatic kind of learning for the prophet Joseph Smith and for the saints as they begin to learn a little bit about this. And Joseph Smith tells us he saw that the Egyptians were taught their knowledge of astronomy by Abraham and Joseph, whose records testify that they got it from the Lord. Now let's go back here for just a second. I have placed here facsimile 3, which is representative of Pharaoh receiving a patriarchal blessing from Abraham. these things are teaching us priesthood kinds of concepts. And here we have facsimile 1. And this is fascinating because how much Joseph Smith understood about this in 1835 in Kirtland, I wouldn't know. But by the time he had worked on these things coming into Nauvoo, he learned that this particular picture that you're looking at is emblematic of the fact that Abraham was saved from the priests of the various gods that his father worshipped who wanted to take his life. He was saved through his use of temple ordinances, which is the reason that he has his hands extended in the manner that he does, and his clothing represents temple clothing. So here we have facsimile 2, which probably contains the temple ordinances that we received in Nauvoo, and the prophet began to work with these things. He worked with them more and more as time went on, and he had a great understanding from them. He had some kind of initial understanding from them when they were in Kirtland, but here's probably the point that's most interesting to us. On October 3rd, 1835, Joseph had the 12 come to his house, and he exhibited the ancient records to the 12 and gave explanations of the things that he saw on them. And his scribe was W. Phelps, the Lord's printer, who was now in Kirtland and working with the brethren on printing there. And he was so inflamed with the truths that were given on the planetary system and man's eternal nature that he stayed up all night on the 3rd of October, 1835, writing his song, If You Could Hie to Kolob. And in this particular song, he expresses these points. There's no end to virtue, to might, to wisdom, light, to union, to youth, to no end of priesthood, no end of truth, no end of glory, no end of love, no end of being, no death above, no end of to glory, there is no end to love, no end to being, there is no death above. So what he got out of that discussion with the prophet on that night in 1835, he felt just opened up his mind to eternity, and the saints began to feel that. This is a photograph of a similar hypocephalus coming from a German museum that is rather interesting, as it has some variances from the Book of Abraham, but many things that are the same. So when the Mormons got these mummies and began to exhibit them, it was no longer this wonderful phenomena that everyone needed to come out and see. It was a subject of ridicule, and in this particular Cleveland Whig article, it's called Another Humbug, and whoever wrote this claims that Joseph had said that one of the mummies was Abimelech, and King Abimelech and his daughter. And Joseph says here, referring to this, I never said any such thing. And he was annoyed with the people, obviously, who were perpetuating this kind of thing. And as he writes in his journal, he says, these are the very same people who were claiming in the name of Judaism that they were going to build their own New Jerusalem nearby, somewhere here, and took time out to ridicule the prophet for what he was doing. Okay, now we're going to go from there to where we're supposed to be today, which is the making of the covenant people, further expanded. Having looked at some of these things in the past, we're going to go a little bit forward and see what actually was taking place when the brethren now entered into a training period, preparing them for the endowment that they were going to receive in this temple. And what this meant was they were going to participate in ordinances along the way, or as soon as the temple got to a state wherein it could be utilized, in which the prophet took the leaders of the priesthood into the temple in a school of the prophets type of meeting, and gave them various experiences that would prepare them and prepare their minds for the fact that they were going to receive an endowment and that they were going to become a different people. They weren't going to just be the pioneers of the Kirtland era, or the gentlemen of the East, as they might have viewed themselves or as they struggled to be. They were of the house of Israel, and they were going to begin to discover a connection with their forefathers who were a covenant people. They could read in the scriptures of a covenant people and even have a longing to be covenant people and to understand what it was, but their understanding of it was just like Nephi prophesied, almost nil, because of the covenants that had been removed, the doctrines and the covenants that had been removed from Holy Writ and from the practice of the ancient people who left us a Christianity without these things in it. So one of the great things that we don't talk about in this class, we're not going to have time to talk about, is the Fishing River expedition. And this is when Joseph took an army, so to speak, of 105 people, I guess, down to Missouri to redeem Jackson County and the land that belonged to the saints who had been driven out in 1833. As they went through that experience, and it is an important experience in church history, they may have been discouraged with how that turned out at that point. But the Lord said to them, it's an expedient in me that the first elders of my church who went down here and who went through this sacrifice and who are setting a pattern of what the redemption of Zion is going to be in the future, it's expedient in me that they should receive their endowment from on high in my house, which I have commanded to be built unto my name in the land of Kirtland. Now this is our governing scripture for this part of our discussion. The Lord said, before you are really going to be able to redeem Israel or redeem Zion, you have to be endowed, and the church has to become more than a handful. It will become a great army. But in order to redeem Israel or Zion or the Lord's people, you have to have a particular blessing given to you and an expansion of your abilities through the power of the Holy Ghost that will come by ordinance in this Kirtland Temple, preparatory as it may be. So these our considerations here are, what was the purpose in the remarkable events that occurred in the Kirtland Temple in January 1836, 2 months prior to its dedication? So what I'm saying to you here is we're going to center on some very remarkable experiences that occurred, particularly beginning January 21st, 1836 in the Kirtland Temple, even before it was finished. As soon as the walls were up, and as soon as there were substantial rooms within the temple, Joseph began to move people into the temple for meetings and for the school of the prophets and other things that they had to accomplish there. So they were getting used to meeting and working within the temple even before they had finished it. And some of these things that happened there were some of the most glorious things that have ever happened in this dispensation. What particular ordinance did the priesthood leaders receive after the temple was dedicated? Now, obviously, by this picture, you're going to take your guess that it would be the ordinance of the washing of feet, which is, of course, the correct answer. But this isn't the first time they participated in this, because we mentioned already that as soon as the Lord talked to them about that on December 27th, in 1832, in what we now have as Section 88, they went out and performed this ordinance, and not just once. There have been periodic performances of this ordinance prior to the time that they get into the temple. When they get into the temple and they participate in this ordinance as a part of the endowment, it assumes even some new aspects. So here we have Orson Pratt talking about this training, and he is recognizing, and he's talking later in Salt Lake City, or the Great Salt Lake Valley, about the early experiences that they had, and he's recognizing that they were preparatory and that they were trainings. And so he says here, and this is an interesting principle to understand, that when the temple was built in Kirtland, the Lord didn't see proper to reveal all the ordinances of the endowment such as we now understand, because in the greater Salt Lake Valley they had a full endowment. He revealed little by little, and he absolutely had to do that, because all of this knowledge that was rolling in and being poured down upon these people was more almost than they could assimilate. And I think I've mentioned to you before that it was almost more than Joseph could assimilate, and Joseph had a mind like nobody since the Lord himself, and Joseph was able to comprehend a great deal more than others of the saints were, but there were at least 3 times by the time we get into this temple endowment business here in Kirtland that he said, "Oh, I think I've finished all my work." And he hadn't, because as soon as he said that, the Lord poured forth on him some great manifestation of what the next thing was going to be. And so he also was learning and growing in spite of the fact that he was leaps and bounds beyond the rest of the members of the church. So Orson says to us here, in this beautiful little temple, there weren't any rooms prepared for washings or no place for anointings such as you understand in this temple. Now, some people in the class have not yet been to the temple, but they do understand that washings would be symbolic, such as baptism is, for washing away sins or for cleansing people, and that anointings would be being blessed with oil that is consecrated, and the individual being set apart as a consecrated servant of the Lord. And that's what's happening here in this early situation, but they didn't have the outlay of a temple as we have it now, because this was preparatory, it was teaching, it was training. And he says at this period of the history of the church, we didn't have all of these things, and we didn't know the necessity of the washing such as we now receive. It is true that we washed our faces and our feet. Now you look at that and you can begin to think, well, that's a little different than what we do in the temple today. So something else was going on, or they had something in addition, or they had a learning experience that isn't necessary for us today. And so he said Joseph, who was the president and presided over the church, as Christ did anciently, was commanded by the Lord to gird himself with a towel in the temple, and he said, and he's saying to us to wash our feet. And he says to his hearers in general conference in the greater Salt Lake Valley, what did he do this for? It was so that the first elder might witness to our Father and God that we were clean from the blood of that wicked generation that then lived. He says, we had already, as members of the 12, gone forth according to our best ability to publish the gospel for thousands of miles on this continent. And after we had done this,